Hi everyone, I'm Sameesha. Today I'm here to break down the motion that reads, in times of huge economic recessions, this House would implement a minimum spending policy. And the Infoslide reads, a minimum spending policy requires households to spend a designated percentage of their income/wealth in a given period of time. This policy applies progressively and would replace taxes either partially or entirely. And I think when you get a motion like this, the first thing to check is if it's this house would motion or this house believes that motion. Because if it is a this house would motion, chances are you have to provide a model to tell me exactly what this minimum spending policy is and what it looks like. But we'll get into that later on when we talk about op and prop case lines. But before that, I think the two questions you need to answer in this debate and make it clear to me from like the first speech onwards is firstly, why during a huge economic recession and what does this look like? And secondly, is the best way to combat a recession having a minimum spending policy or having taxes? So let's just break down a few of like the key words and what it means in the topic. So a recession, I don't think it's enough to tell me that it's just an economic decline, right? You need to tell me the effects of a recession and like the causes of it. So under effects, I think it's fair to say, the GDP is going to drop. Unemployment is going to occur. How? Because businesses are basically going to lose profit, meaning they cut down on production, which means it's more likely that they're going to have slow hiring processes more and have things like layoffs where they basically just fire people. And how there's going to be less spending because during like uncertain times, because prices are going to be higher, people are going to spend less of their disposable income, which means the income that comes after like paying your taxes, right? And like other effects are going to be less investing, fall in stock market. Basically like the entire economy is at an unstable moment, right? That sort of picture needs to be painted out firstly. Secondly, on what are the causes of a recession? Like why are we in a recession right now? Like what happened previously in society for it to come to this point, right? And I think an important point to tell me is it could be like policies that the government itself has implemented, meaning bad economic policies have been implemented, which leads to people having to pay the price with higher taxes or whatever, right? So it isn't fair to them. Secondly, on this idea of demand and supply and the forces between that, right? So if you go on this idea about demand shock, that is to say people will tend to cut back buying items if the price is too high or if the economy isn't doing well, which will drop the demand for like certain products and services, which is going to affect production, meaning that now companies, because they have to maintain a certain level of profit just to sustain themselves, it's going to result in higher rates of unemployment. And it's also going to result in like goods and services being placed at a higher price just because they need to sustain themselves. And secondly, things like innovation and like new businesses are going to drop because people necessarily don't have the money to like start on with it or take that risk to start on, right? Then thirdly on this idea about supply shock, right? Here again, you can go on lines of like in cases of like uncertainty where like a pandemic occurs or there's like conflict, like things like war or just basically like any sort of conflict in a country, you could say that this may result in like a delay or stop of supply of certain goods, which means the prices are going to increase. This is going to lead to people buying less because they really can't afford to, considering the price is high. But then secondly, when the price of raw materials which are used in production to produce another good increases, this is going to lead to either less sales because again the price is high because they need to cover that cost, or it's going to result in again people just not buying it. And then lastly, on this idea about higher inflation. Again, here I think an idea that comes is about purchasing power, right? And basically purchasing power is how much of goods you can buy with a certain note, right? Like one value of money. So for example, so during like a higher inflationary situation, the value of money reduces, meaning with 100 rupees, like previously in a stable economy, if I could buy maybe like 4 apples, right now in a recessionary situation, the purchasing power reduces, meaning now with 100 rupees, chances are I could buy maybe like 2 apples. That is to say, the value of money has decreased. And lastly, again, like on ideas about like interest rate and how in inflationary situations interest rate is going to increase, meaning less loans are taken because people really can't pay back. The people really can't pay back because it's massive interest rates and they just really can't pay it back, right? And then lastly, I think it's this idea on purpose of taxes and if it's really an essential thing to an economy, right? And again, this is, I think, another sort of argumentation that is going to be there in prop and opposition. So I think it's very important that you tell me what your stance on taxes is. This is for proposition, basically. So again, purpose of taxes, I think it's intuitive to say it's revenue for the government, you redistribute the wealth, like the higher class chances are going to have like higher tax rates, like because it is a progressive tax system, how you can regulate like certain goods and services, and how tax revenue is basically like the sort of revenue to provide like public goods and services, which again comes which I would explain like later on. But yeah, so let's just get into like prop line and op line right now, right? So from proposition, I think it's intuitive that you guys do set up a model, because this is a very wide sort of debate topic, and considering it's a this house wood motion, it's essential that you do sort of provide a model and basically tell me how this is going to be implemented and what this looks like, because opposition is going to poke holes on this idea of what a minimum spending policy is, how it looks like, how it's going to affect people, all of that, right? So just to make sure that you don't already create any loops in your case, it's essential that you have a model and cover any sort of questions before opposition comes and burns you with it, right? So a few questions that you guys definitely need to answer is this going to be like a target spending area? Like, is there specific goods that you have to buy? Like, is it essential goods, or what sort of goods is it going to be targeted at, right? Secondly, the duration of the policy, right? Because the motion itself says during recessionary periods of time, right? That is to say, if the economy comes to a stable point, do we drop this policy and go back to a traditional policy, right? So I think that is also an essential question to answer. And then lastly, on this idea about taxes, right? Because I think it's important for prop to come up here and tell me that either they are going to fully substitute tax or partially, right? And saying you're going to fully substitute tax is a very hard stance to take, I believe. So I think it's better you go on this line of saying partially substitute tax, but still it's going to be way less than the traditional tax system that exists, right? Because if you say that no, on our case, chances are taxes are going to be still like the traditional mechanism that's going to be implemented, that is an easy way for op to come up here and say, okay, when I get my income right now, I have two sort of portions of it already been spent, right? So I think it's easy if you go on this line of partially how taxes are going to be substituted, but again, you need to specifically tell me what sort of taxes, like is sales tax going to be less, or is income tax going to be less, right? So those sort of specific questions definitely need to be answered, right? But let's go on to what sort of world we would exist if a minimum spending policy existed right now, right? So a first sort of argument that you guys could definitely run on is this idea about how it's going to stimulate demand, right? And again, this all links back to like the first sort of content that I did bring out on how demand and supply, how those forces are very essential to run an economy. So when you go on this idea about stimulating demand, that is to say, now when you have a minimum spending policy, it's going to boost demand for goods and services. That is going to counter the tendencies that occur during a recessionary period of time, because when the economy is at an unstable point and prices are higher, chances are people are going to spend less, because again, prices are high and they can't really afford it. But secondly, because the economy is unstable, people tend to save during those times, right? So this is going to counteract with that sort of idea. And then secondly, on this idea of preventing deflation, right? So what exactly deflation is? When prices fall during like a deflationary period, which means purchasing power of money increases, right? And again, this is just going to intuitively make you think, okay, isn't that a good thing? Now you can buy more goods and services with 1 unit of 1 unit of currency, or like 1 unit of money, right? But again, it has a counteractive measure, which means the debt that you have taken before becomes way more expensive, meaning you have to pay way more in terms of debt, right? So how is that going to affect the economy right now? Firstly, people have to pay way more, meaning that they can't really afford to spend on things like goods and services. But secondly, it's going to hurt businesses, because to stay in production, it's going to cost even more, meaning that again, it's going to result in lower wages, layoffs, and slow hiring. And then lastly, again, if this minimum spending policy existed, things like it's going to have a redistribution of income, right? Like it's going to be a progressive way. Again, this can be again counteracted from opposition by talking about the idea about income tax, which is a progressive tax where you tax the wealthy and the rich higher, and middle class and lower class just reduces like the tax rate, right? But I think the sort of unique benefit you're going to offer here is, if you go on an idea that income tax doesn't exist on your paradigm, you can go on this idea about how there's going to be direct consumption of it, meaning that chances are, if I as an individual earn like a very high income, when I pay the income tax, I'm not necessarily going to get the direct benefit, because that revenue is going to be spent on things like public services and public goods, which are like things like public hospitals and etc. So if I am a wealthy individual, chances are I'm not going to go to a public hospital, because I do have the revenue to go to a private hospital and get like a better service, right? So that direct consumption doesn't exist when it comes to like income taxes. But when it is a minimum spending policy, meaning you have to spend on like certain goods and services and you yourself is going to consume it, that direct sort of consumption exists, right? And that's sort of a unique area I think that prop would have, which opposition necessarily won't have, but again, you can definitely counteract it. So now getting on to opposition and what sort of lines of argument you guys can run. I think firstly you need to ask a few questions and put these burdens on proposition, right? It could look like questions about asking how this system is going to be implemented and how it is going to be monitored, because chances are you guys could run this argument that the rich can easily just not get away with it by not spending this, or like overspending or whatnot, right? So I think it's intuitive that you do ask questions like that. Secondly, on the idea that if we are done with like a recessionary period, what is going to happen? Is this system still going to be implemented, or are we going to go back to a traditional tax system like what exists in status quo? Thirdly, on this idea about like people who are daily wage earners and who earn like an unpredictable or an income that fluctuates from month to month, right? How are you going to have a minimum spending policy for them? Is it going to be a different rate from month to month, right? Either way, you go on this idea of saying, maybe like go on your argumentation and tell me how it's going to put so much of pressure on these people because they really can't afford to spend so much, or they do have like because they do have like different rates, how that's going to put so much of financial pressure on these individuals and their families, right? And then fourthly, on this idea, again, I think this is based on proposition's case. If they run this argument, if they run their case on either substantially or partially they remove taxes and replace taxes, I think then you have to question on the fact that how are you going to like fund the government? How is the government going to get revenue? Now things like public services, are they going to be offered, or is it going to be at the quality that was offered before? So in this case, you go on to extend it and tell me how public services are very essential for like lower class and middle class individuals, because they can't really afford to consume like the services offered by the government. They can't really pay and get it, right? So even if you go on like the idea of like hospitals, a lot of people really can't afford it because it's so expensive. So it's considered like a luxury to them. But fact that there are hospitals, that there are like government hospitals where you don't really have to like pay, either you don't have to pay or you don't have to pay like massive like exorbitant amounts. This is what helps these lower and middle class individuals, right? So what is going to happen to that scenario if taxes are going to be cut down or taxes are going to be fully replaced, right? So these sort of questions need to be put on proposition, and they need to be burned with that and come up with answers later on in their case, right? But what can opposition run, right? Here again, I think the idea about economic freedom and how individuals should be able to spend on whatever they want, because this is hard-earned income that they themselves have earned, right? And here you go on to extend it and tell me how individuals have like different objectives, financial objectives, meaning that if I am an individual who is going to retire maybe in 5-10 years, my main sort of objective is to save for my retirement, right? But an individual who has like a family and who has like little children, chances are their main sort of objective is to invest in their child's education or just keep the family afloat, right? So financial objectives of each sort of individual is going to be completely different. But when you do have like a minimum spending policy, how it's going to blur these sort of objectives, because right now a portion of your income is already being spent, right? Then lastly, on this idea about how forced spending can lead to inflation, right? Again, here you tie it in with the idea of the supply and demand forces and how this is going to cause, when you do have a minimum spending policy, how you're going to increase demand, which means that things like it's not going to be balanced with supply, meaning prices of goods and services are going to increase and people necessarily can't afford it, leading to an inflationary situation. Then you can also go on the extent of telling me how this is going to affect like higher class and middle class people, because chances are when it is a minimum spending policy, you do tend to spend only on like essential goods and services or necessities, right? But necessities can change from family to family or individual to individual, right? So this is going to affect the quality of life, because now people can't spend on things that they do want and things that actually gain them some sort of satisfaction or utility, right? So this is going to affect people in their quality of life. But lastly, on this idea about innovation and how people now necessarily aren't going to take that risk because they do know that they don't have much, they don't have as enough money as they did before, because they don't want to take a risk, meaning they just work to sort of sustain themselves, and because they do know they have to pay this sort of they do know that they have to pay this sort of amount, right? And how lastly, how people necessarily don't have like spare cash to spend, and how things like underlying issues aren't sorted out, right? So even if you agree to the fact that maybe a minimum spending policy would work for like a short period of time, the long sort of economic goals that a country has to sustain itself in the future isn't going to happen, because this is like a short-term fix and this is a long-term problem. So it doesn't really match up. So even right now, even if it all seems okay and prices are good and demand and supply forces seem to be balanced off, there is going to be future repercussions because you're not sort of solving the underlying issue that exists, right? And I think that's mainly what I have for opposition. But yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.